The Professional Fighting League was launched in 2018 by venture capitalist Don Davis following the purchase of the World Series of Fighting. As a promotion, it attempts to separate itself from other MMA leagues, and at first glance, it seems easy enough to grasp. Just imagine the fighters of football teams in the Premier League or NFL competing for points in an attempt to reach the playoffs. Simple, right? Well, not quite. Once a potential fan tries to dip more than a toe into the world of PFL, they're met with a smorgasbord of sub-leagues, rule changes, niche cliquey terminology, and general discombobulation to a degree that after 5 minutes of struggling to comprehend their confusing website features, one is simply left asking, what the hell is PFL? So first things first, let's approach this in good faith. As members of the mixed martial arts community, we should be welcoming alternatives to the monopolistic practices of the UFC, with currently suffocating opportunities for fighters and limiting choices for fans. A mistake most new MMA promotions make when trying to compete with the UFC is they do everything pretty much exactly the same as Dana, but with a few inconsequential differences thrown in. Pride proved a true rival to the UFC at its peak, because the pageantry and radically different rule set made it unique. Meanwhile, promotions like Bellator tried to act like they were a different product because their cage was a circle and not an octagon. Crazy, right? So the PFL should be commended for trying to stick out from the crowd by utilizing a points-based league system, and it's not actually all that bad in theory. By tying fighters' performances to a numerical figure, it makes the process of deciding who should fight for a title feel more meritocratic. You wouldn't have a situation like in the UFC with Tony Ferguson never realizing a fight for a unified title shot after 12 consecutive wins, while Alex Pereira found himself fighting for a championship in just 3 fights. The PFL should also be applauded for its slightly more progressive approach to fighter pay. For example, during the COVID lockdowns, the PFL handed out monthly stipends to help out its athletes who can no longer compete for a living. They also give a much higher percentage of pay-per-view sales to its headlining athletes and offer a massive $1 million prize to the winner of each season. So perhaps the PFL is a place for true hardcore fans of the sport. Those who want to see fighters be given opportunities as a result of their hard work, and not how willing they are to dissolve into degenerate trash talk to sell pay-per-views. The PFL pride themselves on being a place where fighters have to earn their spot, and feel they've achieved this by using their unique points system.
One of the biggest differences between the PFL and other MMA leagues is that it runs on a points system, meaning fighters have to actually earn their way to a title fight by earning points inside the cage and not just with the matchmaker.
Intriguing as this point system may be, the fact remains that the league system doesn't easily translate to an MMA format. The first major issue is that since not all fights are made spontaneously, but rather are scheduled like a football calendar, actually make the system meritocratic. It actually makes it random, which is very different. Imagine a football league that has each team play each other twice in a season to determine who the best team is. This works because it spreads out the possible variables over many teams over a long period of time to get an average of how each team performed overall that season. In the PFL, each weight class has its own league of 10 fighters for that season. And I'm sure you can already tell the problem. Each fighter couldn't possibly fight each other once, let alone twice in a single year, meaning fighters only face 2 of a possible 10 opponents before reaching the playoff stages of the competition. Considering the PFL's roster is mostly made up of retired UFC fighters and regional prospects, the talent pool in these divisions varies widely, meaning whether or not you progress is less a reflection of skill, but more so how lucky you got with the draw of possible opponents. This undoubtedly sparks a question. If there are only 10 places in each weight class, how do they determine who qualifies for these spots? And this is truly where the PFL business plan starts crumbling down. So, in order to make it into the regular tournament season, the PFL set up a subdivision called the PFL Challenger Series, which has young and upcoming athletes compete for a regular place. Amazing. However, this sub-league only operates within North America, meaning unless the PFL wants to become the National Football League of MMA, they would have to create some more sub-leagues elsewhere. And so, naturally, we have PFL Europe.
32 fighters in 4 different weight classes, representing countries from all over Europe.
This, much like the Challenger Series, is a league for European athletes to fight for the opportunity to progress to a higher league. But you have its second international league, PFL MENA.
32 fighters across 4 different weight classes will compete in the same regular season format,
which holds the season in Saudi Arabia. And who could forget the most recent announcement of PFL Africa, launching in 2025, with their latest major signing, Francis Ngannou, acting as chairman. Winners of PFL Europe MENA, and Africa will be given a spot in the 10-man regular season. But here's a big question, considering how much more competitive MMA is in Europe as opposed to Africa and in the Middle East. Does it even make sense for each of these leagues to earn the same number of places? If out of the 10 regular season spots, 4 come from PFL feeder leagues, how do we decide who gets the other 6 spots? One would assume at least 3 would come from PFL Australia, PFL Latam, and PFL Asia, which are 3 more sub-leagues coming in 2025. But what about the others? These are seemingly all questions the PFL just makes up answers to on the spot, fumbling their way through the spur-of-the-moment decisions.
PFL launches regional leagues across the world.
We're creating the Champions League of MMA.
Or just have a normal fight card like everyone else. There's no reason it has to feel like an entirely new sport. Despite the abysmal marketing, nerfed rule set, and B-tier roster, the PFL does have the benefit of having a lot of disposable income from wealthy investors to flush down the drain. In the most recent act of money burning for questionable reasons, the PFL bought a terminally ill promotion in Bellator around late 2023. Now, buying Bellator wasn't in itself a terrible idea. Sure, they had a dull aesthetic, little brand recognition, and hemorrhaging money every show, but they did have a half-decent roster of some semi-well-known fighters amongst hardcore fans. It made all the sense in the world then to merge the 2 rosters and build an even more robust talent pool to sell to the fans as an alternative to the UFC, whose roster had become slightly more diluted in recent years.
Merging it all into one would be the most exciting thing, and having Bellator champs versus PFL champs, or Bellator fighters versus PFL fighters under the PFL umbrella, probably makes the most sense in the long term.
But no. Rather than absorb Bellator's roster into the PFL, they decided to create yet another sub-league called the Bellator International Championship Series. Confusingly though, this isn't a feeder league to the regular season like the other sub-leagues, but follows the traditional UFC format of reigning champions defending their old Bellator belts, separate from the rest of the PFL.
But you're basically building this brand where people don't know which one they're supposed to watch, and then on top of that, it's hard to find which one to watch.
At this point, fans are begging for the PFL to just simplify things. They're all on board for a UFC alternative that compensates fighters adequately, but it just felt like at every opportunity the PFL was making itself as difficult to follow and understand as possible. And just when you didn't think this promotion could get any more bewildering, the PFL announced the Superfight division. Explaining exactly why the PFL Superfight division is one of the most ironic and hilarious mishaps of recent MMA promotion is difficult, but well worth taking our time with. You see, when Francis Ngannou left the UFC and signed with the PFL, his main reasoning was that he wasn't being respected by the UFC, and this was being reflected in his pay.
As an independent contractor, I have to look up to myself and do what's right for me.
He signed to the PFL in part because it was offering $30 million, but also because he saw it as a more meritocratic organization that treated and compensated its roster far better than his previous employer. Like all things PFL, this makes sense at first, until you realize that Francis is by far the most valuable player the promotion has, and risking him fighting and losing to some no-name in the first round of the Challenger Series or regular season could spell disaster for their investment. And so they needed to create a new sub-league for fighters like Francis to fight in, who were too valuable to risk competing in the league format, and thus the PFL Superfight division was born. But the Superfight division doesn't operate like the rest of the PFL leagues. Rather than earn a place in the final, the fights are based on the status and name value of the individuals who compete in it. In short, the Superfight division is run the exact same as the UFC, except now Jake Paul is Dana White, and hardly anyone is watching.
Join the PFL, baby.
Sure, PFL Superfight headline fighters will get 50% of their pay-per-view sales.
Of this new PFL Superfight division, our fighters will be receiving 50% of the revenue.
But when the general consensus is that PFL pay-per-view numbers are unlikely to exceed 50K, 20% of 500K UFC pay-per-views start to look much more appealing. Wait a minute, hold on. Jake Paul.
Ladies and gentlemen, PFL season is back.
Yep, Jake Paul is technically the co-founder of the Superfight division and holds the official title as the head of fighter advocacy. In return, the PFL expects Jake will take his first MMA fight under their banner and use his clout to bring in more numbers.
I want it to be an MMA fight.
That's so dope, guys. Look at, yo.
Which leads us into our next topic of discussion. What's with all the gimmicks being thrust down our throats all the time? Signing Francis Ngannou and making him chairman is one thing. The man's a former world champion, seemingly with good intentions for other athletes. But making Jake Paul head of fighter advocacy on the vague promise he might one day grace your cage with zero MMA experience just comes off a bit desperate and clout chasing. It doesn't end there though. Who can forget the bizarre concept of the smart cage? The idea being the cage records and relays important information back to the viewer, except for the fact that almost none of the information being provided is either important or helpful.
I really don't have anything bad to say about PFL at all, except you gotta be kidding me with this made-up math they have on the screen. Descriptions of speed of things that, again, otherwise don't mean anything. Like, oh, a punch was 20 miles an hour. What does that mean?
There could be a common ground. You could bring them up for maybe 20 seconds per round, but why are we covering the entire screen? I absolutely hate that. It looks tacky and it's like distracting from the fight. And there's sometimes there's something on the screen that you might want to see, but now it's blocked because you literally have a 4-inch high graphic by 6 inches wide graphic. It's crazy. I don't know why they implement that.
This echoes the recent trend of false promises we see advertised to us in our regular lives. Novelty tech like Google Glass, 3D TVs, Apple Vision, and the metaverse are all marketed as revolutionary ideas that'll change the way you experience media. But turns out to be just as much of a money grab as NFTs, which the PFL also decided to jump on the bandwagon of in 2020, to unsurprisingly little success. The PFL fan token was supposed to allow fans to be able to engage with their favorite fighters, access exclusive content, and even vote on fights and bonuses. Let's put aside the hypocrisy in calling yourself a meritocracy while having a popularity contest for main event slots and bonuses, and focus on the fact that this also turned out to be a massive failure. Almost none of the features worked as intended, and reviews on Trustpilot claim the company responsible are effectively scammers and con artists. And in painfully predictable fashion, another PFL tech gimmick went down the drain. While we're on the topic of tech, let's take a look at the PFL website, which, for all intents and purposes, is like trying to solve the Da Vinci Code, but the cryptex is covered in lubricant. And on fire. The most basic information about how the league actually works is easy enough to find, but figuring out exactly how all the leagues and sub-leagues were supposed to interact with each other required a significant amount of Googling. Clicking on the Standings tab, for example, only showed the results of the regular season, which is confusing in and of itself. But what makes it even worse is the fact that to new visitors, it makes no sense. For example, under the light heavyweight results for the 2024 season, Rob Wilkinson and Daletsan Yagshimuradov have the same number of points, despite Wilkinson having lost. This is because both fighters have won their regular season fights, but only Daletsan has won in the playoffs. So PFL updates the record of the fighter that season, but doesn't bother updating the table as points are no longer relevant. Which would be like the Champions League continuing to keep a record of how many matches a team had after they'd already progressed through the group stage, showing the results on the table after it had already ended. Fine. But why? So let's say you want to see previous event results, what's coming up next, or just who's in the PFL roster. Well, do you mean the regular season, or one of the 5 other sub-leagues? Do you want to watch PFL content? Well, almost all the fast channels they host links to don't work. And if you do find one that happens to work, you can look forward to having to sign up to yet another streaming service for the privilege of watching old seasons. The streaming service doesn't even bother providing a thumbnail. They have 5 separate tabs to watch all the different sub-leagues, despite the fact that they all just send you to the same DAZN anyways. Which, yes, you'll also have to sign up for. Now, let's say you do force yourself to learn about the rules, the sub-leagues, the mostly unknown roster, and decide you want to pick up some PFL merch to prove what a fan you are. The first thing you'll see if you click in the PFL store? Bellator merch.
Number one priority right now, honestly, would be redesign the website. Make it more intuitive. I can't find the cards. I can't find the start times. You have to find a way to make it easier for fans to consume your fights.
So, you're at the brink of throwing your monitor out the nearest window in frustration, and in one last attempt to give PFL a chance, you ask their chatbot to see how the league works. Seemingly aware of its own incompetence, the chatbot will proceed to ignore your question, beg for help, and ask if you want a job. It should come as no surprise to the viewer that as a business, the PFL loses millions of dollars every year. But the problem with PFL isn't that it doesn't have enough money. They have plenty of wealthy investors providing pretty much a blank check. The problem is that the UFC has already locked down the fighter market in coercive contracts.
The extension is that because they say if you deny a fight, they can extend you for 6 months or something. If you're hurt and can't fight, they can extend you for 6 months or something.
If they want to pay for you, they can pay for you. But the issue is if the contract makes these guys on the carousel of availability so few and far between that it basically doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter how much money you have.
No, you're right.
This means that the only way the PFL can genuinely acquire enough top-tier talent to compete is if legislation is put into place that allows fighters to auction their talents to different promoters.
Which is, imagine that the fighter lawsuit already finished, and then the judge came down and said, hey, every UFC contract is going to have an expiration of 2 years, no matter what, right? Well, now that's a different ballgame. I mean, that's a completely different ballgame.
The most important thing to acknowledge about the PFL is that every decision they make is based on what the investors think will sell. They have very little understanding about what MMA fans actually want. They don't seem to grasp that countless gimmicks don't make the fan experience any better, but scream snake oil salesman. You can't claim to be more meritocratic than the UFC and then have a special division for your company favorites and host a popularity contest to determine how much people get paid at the end of the night. You can't draw in a new fan base while presenting a more convoluted product than what they're used to. And you can't solve the problem of the UFC monopolization by throwing more money at it. The PFL came into the spotlight as a legitimate alternative to the UFC that would revolutionize fighter pay and business practices. But when we stand back, we see it's actually 3 millionaires in a trench coat pretending to be an ethical promoter, leaving us exactly where we started. When you strip back the false promises and big investor checks, what the hell is PFL?